Thomas Aldridge scouted the Oregon Trail for 11 years. He guided more than 40 wagon companies from Independence, Missouri to the Willamette Valley. And in all of that time, across all of those miles, he gave exactly one interview about what he had seen. A newspaper correspondent in Salem, Oregon found him in the spring of 1871 and asked him what he remembered most clearly from his years on the trail. Thomas was quiet for a long moment before he answered. He said he remembered a woman crossing the Blue Mountains alone in October of 1857 on a gray horse with a saddlebag full of medicine. He said he had watched her emerge from the tree line at 7,000 feet in a wind that was stripping the last leaves off the aspens, and that she looked as though she had decided something a long time ago and was only now arriving at the place where the decision had to be proved. The correspondent asked if she had been frightened. Thomas thought about that too, and then he said he didn't know. He said he had been frightened watching her, and that was enough. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 34 years old when the wagon company assembled at Independence in the first week of May 1857, and she arrived alone, without a husband, without children, and without, as Captain Alderman Price noted in his company ledger, any obvious reason for making the journey at all. She had paid her way in full. She had a good wagon, 2 oxen in reasonable health, and a gray mare named Locket tied behind. What she did not have, as far as the rest of the company could see, was anyone to answer to or anyone who was answering to her, and in 1857 on the Oregon Trail, that was its own kind of problem. She had been born Ruth Havers in Lancaster County, Ohio, the third daughter of a Presbyterian minister and a woman who had kept a garden so large and so productive that half the county had eaten from it at one time or another without always knowing it. She had married at 22 Daniel Calloway, a cabinet maker, a quiet man with careful hands who loved her without theater and built her a table that could seat 12. They had 10 years together. They had no children, which had been a sorrow, and then Daniel had taken a fever in the autumn of 1854 and was gone in 9 days, which had been a different kind of sorrow altogether. The kind that doesn't announce its shape right away, that arrives instead in pieces, over months, in the middle of ordinary tasks. She stayed in Ohio for 2 years after Daniel died. She ran the household, helped in her sister Agnes's kitchen, sat in church, visited with neighbors. She did all of it correctly. She did not do any of it with the feeling that she was alive. In the spring of 1856, her brother-in-law Henry Marsh came home from a lecture in Columbus with fire in his eyes and a pamphlet in his coat pocket about land in the Willamette Valley. He talked about it for 3 months. Agnes cried every time he brought it up. Ruth was the one who finally said to Henry, quietly, at the kitchen table when Agnes had gone upstairs, "Go. Take her. I'll come with you." Henry asked if she was sure. Ruth said she had never been less sure of anything in her life, which she said was actually a good sign. What she was afraid of was this: arriving in Oregon with nothing left of herself. Not afraid of the trail, or not only afraid of that, afraid of becoming what she could see herself becoming in Ohio. Very slowly, if she stayed. A shadow woman. A useful presence. Agnes's sister who helped with the children and knew where everything was kept and would certainly be fine. She had looked at that life from every angle and could not find, anywhere in it, a piece of land she would tend herself, a garden she had planted, a table she had built with her own hands or watched someone build for her alone. She was going to Oregon because staying was a kind of dying. And Ruth Calloway had decided she was not ready to die. The wagon company assembled that first week of May with 47 souls and 19 wagons, and within 2 weeks on the Platte River Road, the word for Ruth Calloway had settled into the company's vocabulary like a stone into mud. Stubborn. She would not leave her mother's oak chest behind when Price told everyone at the Big Blue River crossing to reduce their loads. She argued, calmly, which was somehow worse than shouting, that the chest was not significantly heavier than the tools Milo Ward was carrying or the second rocking chair the Hendersons had refused to surrender. Price said it wasn't about the individual weight, it was about the principle. Ruth said if it was about the principle, perhaps he could explain the principle to her more precisely, and which principle exactly outweighed the fact that her mother had carried that chest from Pennsylvania to Ohio in 1821 and Ruth had been the one to carry it out of her mother's house when she died. Price walked away. The chest stayed. She was not unpleasant. That was the thing that confused people. She helped where she could, with the cooking rotations, with the children, with the Nediger family's sick ox. She did not gossip. She did not demand sympathy. She sat by herself in the evenings and wrote in a small journal with a leather cover and did not show it to anyone. Mabel Price, the captain's wife, said to Margaret Henderson one evening while Ruth was out of earshot, "There's a woman who has decided she doesn't need a single person's good opinion." Margaret said that sounded lonely. Mabel said she thought it sounded almost peaceful, and then looked surprised that she'd said it. Thomas Aldridge had been scouting the trail since 1846. He had crossed South Pass in a blizzard and come out fine. He had forded the Snake River at its worst and lost nothing more important than his hat. He had a way of reading the land that the wagon captains trusted, and a way of reading people that he mostly kept to himself. He noticed Ruth Calloway at the Big Blue River argument, not because it was unusual for someone to argue with Price — people argued with Price regularly — but because of how she argued. No raised voice, no appeal to emotion, just the specific fact of the matter, delivered without apology and without cruelty. He had not seen many people argue that way. He had tried to argue that way himself once or twice, and found it harder than it looked. He did not speak to her until Fort Laramie, Wyoming, at mile 665, where the company stopped for 3 days to rest the animals and make repairs. He found her at the trading post, examining a worn map tacked to the wall behind the counter. She was tracing a route with one finger, not the standard route, but a variation through the mountains that the post's owner, a man named Delaney, had marked in pencil and then crossed out. Thomas stood beside her for a moment and said, without introduction, "Delaney crossed that out because the creek crossing's impassable after August." Ruth said, without turning her head, "I know. I'm looking at it to understand why, not because I intend to use it." Thomas said that was a reasonable distinction. She finally looked at him. She said, "You're the scout." He said he was. She asked if he'd crossed the Blue Mountains in October. He said he had, twice. She asked what the worst of it was. He thought about it honestly. He said the worst was the wind and the isolation, the way the forest closed around you and the trail narrowed to almost nothing and you couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead in any direction. She nodded as though she was filing that away. She thanked him and went back to the map. South Pass at mile 947 was the roof of the world, or it felt like it. 7,412 feet of elevation, the ground rocky and spare, the sky so large it seemed to press down rather than lift up. The company crossed on August 14th, a Tuesday, the grass already going brown at the edges in a way that meant summer was not loaning them much more time. Ruth walked the whole of it, wouldn't ride, saved Lockett's strength, and Thomas watched her from horseback as he ranged ahead and back. She walked with her chin up, which he had noticed she always did. Not from pride, he had begun to think, but from attention. She was always looking at the horizon, as though she was trying to see something nobody had told her was there yet. They were 10 days past Fort Bridger when Henry Marsh took sick. It came on quickly, the way the trail's worst things always did. A fever in the evening, a wet cough by morning, the eyes going glassy in a way his wife Agnes recognized and could not name. Ruth took the reins of Henry's wagon without discussion. She drove through the day without complaint, checked the oxen at the nooning, fed the children in the back of the wagon. The eldest, Samuel, was 12, the youngest, Clara, was 4, and nursed Henry through the night with a patience that, several people in the company later admitted, they had not expected from her. Mabel Price came by with broth. Ruth thanked her. They did not say much else, but something shifted between them, the way it sometimes does between women when one of them is watching the other do a hard thing with grace. Henry was better by the time they reached Fort Boise, weak but upright, almost himself. The company rested a day, and that evening Ruth sat against the wheel of Henry's wagon in the last of the daylight and fell asleep sitting up, her journal open on her knee, her head tipped against the wood. The Marsh children were tucked against her like sparrows. Thomas saw it from across the camp. He told himself there was nothing particular to see and walked away. The Blue Mountains began to show themselves in the first week of October, a blue-gray mass on the horizon that looked, at that distance, like weather. The trail turned south and then east, climbing steadily through pine and fir so old and so dense that the light came down in pieces rather than sheets. The company moved slower here. The wagons strained on the grades, axles broke, tempers shortened. A woman named Harriet Beam sat down on a boulder at the top of a grade and said she could not go another step, and meant it, and her husband and her oldest son had to talk her back to her feet for nearly half an hour. Ruth passed them going up, without stopping, though she said something quietly to Harriet as she went by. Nobody heard what, and Harriet was moving again 20 minutes later. They broke through the worst of it on a Wednesday, the 14th of October, onto a ridge where the trees parted and the world opened up to the west. The valley below, the sun going down behind the Cascades, the end of things visible for the first time in months. Several people cried. Captain Price shook hands with the men nearest him. Someone opened a bottle of whiskey and it went around. Thomas stood apart from it, as he usually did at moments like this, and watched the sky go from orange to red to the deep blue of early night. He thought, "They're going to make it." He let himself think it, just for a moment. That was longer than he usually allowed. The following morning, little Clara Marsh woke with a fever. Not the mild fevers that trailed children through every journey. Something different in the color of her skin, in the way she wouldn't wake fully, in the sound her breathing made. Agnes held her all morning. Ruth watched Agnes's face and recognized what she saw there, because she had been a minister's daughter and had been taught early to read it. The specific fear of someone who is starting to understand that love is not sufficient protection. There was a Methodist mission station at the Umatilla River, 2 days back. Ruth knew it from the map. She had studied that map at Fort Laramie and every map since. She knew there was a physician there, a man named Dr. Hadley, who had been treating trail travelers for 7 years. She also knew that the company could not wait 2 days and could not go back. The weather was turning, the Cascades were ahead, and every day they delayed was a day closer to snow in the passes. She stood with Henry and Agnes and Captain Price in front of the marsh wagon and said what she had already decided. She would go back. She had Lockett. She knew the way. She would ride to the Umatilla mission, get whatever Dr. Hadley could give her for a child with a high fever and labored breathing, and she would meet them at the Dalles before the end of the week. Price looked at her for a long moment. He said no woman went back alone through the Blue Mountains. He said the trail was not safe. He said the weather was uncertain. He said it was the most stubborn, foolhardy, unreasonable thing he had heard proposed on any of his crossings. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who had buried people on this trail and did not want to bury another. Ruth said Clara Marsh was 4 years old. There was a silence. It was the kind of silence that falls when something true has been said and the room, or in this case the trail, the cold mountain air, the pines standing around them like witnesses, does not know how to answer it. Then Thomas said, quietly from the edge of the group, he would wait at Dead Man's Pass. If she wasn't through by the following evening, he would come looking. Ruth looked at him. She did not say thank you. She said, "Don't come looking until morning." He said he supposed that was fair. She turned and began to saddle Lockett. She passed her mother's oak chest on the way out of camp. It was sitting where she had left it the week before, at the side of the trail where she had finally, without ceremony, set it down when the grade had become too much for the oxen. She stopped Lockett and looked at it for a moment. The iron hinges had gone orange with road rust. The wood had dried in the mountain air and one corner had split. She had thought when she left it that it would be the hardest thing she did on the trail. She understood now that she had been wrong about what hard would look like. She rode back into the Blue Mountains as the morning light was still gray and thin between the trees. The pines closed over her almost immediately, and the camp sounds fell away, and there was only the wind and the creak of leather and Lockett's breathing and the trail stretching back through the dark beneath the branches. She was afraid. She noted it the way she had learned to note her own fear. Not dismiss it, Just name it and set it alongside her in the saddle and continue. The trail back was harder to read in this direction. She had come through it going west, the right way, and now everything was reversed. The landmarks, the grades, the places where the path split and she had to choose without being certain. There was a crossing at the creek at mile 8 where the bank had softened with recent rain, and Lockett went in to the knee before Ruth got her across. She noted the cold of the water when it soaked through her boot. She noted the way her hands shook briefly on the reins and then steadied. She talked to Lockett, which she always did when things were difficult and which always helped, though she could not have said exactly why. She reached the Umatilla mission station in the late afternoon of the first day. Dr. Hadley was a small man, older than she'd expected, with a neatness about him that belonged to a different world than the one outside his door. He listened to her description of Clara's symptoms carefully, and asked 2 or 3 questions, and then went to his shelf. He gave her laudanum for the fever, a compound in a brown bottle that he called his chest mixture, and instructions written on paper in a hand so deliberate and careful that she thought, "This man knows his writing will travel." She thanked him. He said she shouldn't try the mountains at night. She said she appreciated the advice. She left at first light. The return was the worst of it. The wind came up on the second morning, not a gentle wind but the kind that moves through mountain passes with something like intention, getting into the collar of your coat and staying. The pines sang in it, if singing was the word, a low constant sound like a crowd murmuring at a distance. Lockett walked with her head down. Ruth leaned forward and kept her eyes on the trail 10 feet ahead, because looking further was not useful. There was a place, at roughly the midpoint of the return crossing, where the trail narrowed between 2 boulder faces and then opened onto a small plateau with a view east and west. She stopped Lockett there and let her breathe. The valley to the east, the direction she had come from, was already in shadow. To the west, above the tree line, the sky was still bright. She was closer to the other side than to where she'd started. She had not known that until this moment, and it mattered more than she expected. The last 2 hours were the hardest. Not because the terrain was worse, but because she was tired in the specific way that comes at the end of something, the kind of tired where the body begins to argue with the mind about whether continuing is truly necessary. She had a conversation with herself that she did not record in her diary, or if she did, those pages are gone. What she wrote that evening was this: "I thought about the oak chest most of the last hour, not with grief, just aware of it, the way you're aware of a place where something used to be. The trail takes what it takes. You don't get to decide what that is." Thomas saw her come out of the tree line at 5 minutes past 4 in the afternoon of October the 17th. He had been at the pass since the previous morning, as he said he would be, and he had not come looking until morning, as she had asked. He had begun to think about it, around midday, had begun to think about the mathematics of it, how far she would have had to go and how long the return would take, and what the wind had been doing in the mountains overnight. He was still doing the mathematics when she came out of the trees. She was riding Lockett at a walk, upright in the saddle, her coat dark with moisture from the air in the pines. The saddlebag on her left side hung heavy. She came up the trail toward him without hurrying, and when she reached him she stopped and took the saddlebag off and handed it across without speaking. Her hands were chapped and red from the cold, the skin at the knuckles cracked. He took the bag. He looked at her face. She looked like someone who had made a decision a long time ago and had just finished discovering what it had cost. He said, "Did you find him?" She said, "I found him." He said, "Are you all right?" She thought about that honestly, the way she always did, and said, "I will be." He handed her his canteen. She drank from it and handed it back. They rode west together in the last of the afternoon light, down off the pass and toward the Dalles, and he did not ask her anything else, which was the right thing to do and which she noted later in her diary. Clara Marsh recovered. The laudanum and the brown bottle and a week of Agnes's fierce, steady nursing brought her back, and by the time the company reached the Willamette Valley in the first days of November, She was walking again and eating and asking questions about everything, the way 4-year-olds do when they are alive and have decided to prove it. Ruth Calloway filed a land claim in the Willamette Valley on November the 19th, 1857. 40 acres in the hills south of the valley floor, with good drainage and a creek and a view of the Cascades on a clear day. She built a small cabin that first winter with help from Henry and a neighbor named Fowler she had met at the land office. She put in a kitchen garden the following spring. The first seeds she planted were the ones she had been keeping in a pouch in her coat pocket since Ohio. Her mother's seeds, carried all the way from the garden she could not stop thinking about. She built a table that summer from the lumber of 2 pines that had come down in a November storm. It was not as fine as Daniel's table, it was hers. She never wrote about the Blue Mountains crossing as bravery. She wrote about it as a calculation. She wrote, "Clara needed medicine. I had a horse and I knew the road. Other things seem like a great deal less." Thomas Aldridge, in his interview with the Salem newspaper correspondent in 1871, was asked again what he remembered most about Ruth Calloway. He took his time answering. He said he remembered the way she came out of the tree line at the pass, upright and unhurried, the saddlebag heavy on her left side. He said he had been watching that trail for 2 hours by then. He said there were things you saw on this trail that you understood at the time and things you understood later, and this was one of the later ones. He said, "The wagon train called her stubborn. I expect that's fair, but I think what she was decided. She'd made up her mind what kind of woman she was going to be, and she went ahead and was that woman, even when it was very cold and very far and very alone. That's not stubbornness, that's just character. I don't know that I've watched anything braver in my life, and I've watched a great deal." The correspondent asked if he'd kept in touch with her. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He said he had, for a time. He said she had a good garden, last he knew. He said the table she'd built was holding up. He said she seemed, when he saw her, like someone who had found what she went to Oregon to find. He said he thought she deserved it.